All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're breaking down the core theological argument of a sermon called The Lord Has Cleansed Our Hearts. We're going to walk through its claims, step by step, to really get a handle on its unique take on Christian salvation.
So right off the bat, the sermon poses this really provocative idea. It asks you to think about this. What if a fundamental piece of the salvation puzzle, something the early church knew, was just lost to history? That's the central question this whole text is trying to answer.
To build its case, the sermon starts by pointing to what it calls a modern crisis of faith. The argument is that for a lot of Christians today, something is just fundamentally off. And the diagnosis here is super specific. According to this text, believers today don't have real conviction. They're constantly wrestling with this feeling of sinfulness that their faith just can't seem to solve. And because of that, many are leaving their churches, wandering around like, lost sheep. The sermon claims that this kind of faith is built more on emotion than on the solid ground of truth.
In this quote, this is where the sermon really lays its cards on the table. It argues that this crisis isn't new at all, but that it comes from a centuries-old blind spot. The reason people are trapped, it claims, is because they've been missing a crucial piece of information, what the sermon calls the truth of baptism.
So that leads us straight into a historical argument. The sermon doesn't just say there's a problem now. It points to a very specific moment in the past where, it claims, everything went off track.
This timeline here basically lays out the whole historical case. The idea is that the early church had the complete picture. They believed in the power of both Jesus' baptism and his crucifixion. But then, in the year 325, you get the Council of Nicaea, which creates the Nicene Creed. And from this sermon's point of view, that document, a cornerstone for so much of Christianity, is actually incomplete.
And there it is. This is the sermon's central historical claim, that the Nicene Creed and all the beliefs built on top of it left out the theological importance of Jesus' baptism. And that single omission, it argues, is the historical error that led to the modern crisis of faith we talked about. Okay, so if something's missing, then what is it? In this next section, the sermon lays out its answer, defining what it presents as the complete, true path to salvation.
This slide gets right to the heart of the whole argument. On one side, you've got what the sermon calls the mainstream view. Salvation comes from believing Jesus died on the cross. Period. But on the other side is the sermon's core teaching that real salvation requires you to believe in two connected acts, Jesus' baptism and his death on the cross.
And the sermon presents this really precise three-step logic. Step 1, you've got the problem, which is all of humanity's sin. Step 2, Jesus' baptism wasn't just some symbol, it was a literal transfer, the moment when all those sins were actually passed on to him. And step 3, only after he'd taken on those sins could the crucifixion happen, serving as the final payment for them. And this logic all builds up to the sermon's central doctrine, which it calls the gospel of the water and the Spirit, a phrase that really sums up its entire theological framework.
So let's break down that terminology. The water, that refers directly to Jesus' baptism, the moment the sermon says he took on the world's sins. And the Spirit, which the text also connects to the blood, refers to his death on the cross, the ultimate payment for those sins. According to this teaching, you just can't have one without the other.
And the sermon is crystal clear on this point. To be truly free from sin, a believer has to accept both truths. It's the baptism and the blood, the water and the Spirit working together that make up the complete remission of sins.
So what's the end game here? What's the point of all this teaching? Well, the final section of the sermon moves from explaining all this to a direct call to action for its audience. And the conclusion is a really powerful challenge. It calls on people to throw out what it sees as incomplete or purely emotional beliefs that are tied to the Nicene Creed. It urges them to return to what it defines as the true word, with the baptism right at the center. And the ultimate goal? To kick off a new reformation of faith for our time. And this leads to the sermon's ultimate promise, a complete and total transformation. The idea is that by accepting this gospel of the water and the Spirit, a believer isn't just forgiven. No, the claim is they are made righteous and completely sinless in the eyes of God. And that brings us to the end of this breakdown, leaving us with one last thing to think about. The entire argument we've just walked through really hinges on the theological weight of a single event, and it makes you wonder, how much can one event, and how you interpret it, truly change a story that's been told for 2,000 years?